Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is artificial selection. We talked about natural selection, right? Natural selection. This is kind of a natural process, meaning that you know, uh, an animal's environment or plant's environment is influencing it through natural forces. There's not a sort of this guiding hand, which is what we are going to be in the process of artificial selection. We are able to shape our environment to a unique degree. I'm sure you guys are aware of that. And this hand over here, of course, this image is Daniel Noretto in the Cornell Alliance for Science. That's where I got this off of Twitter. He's holding an apple. You guys have seen that before. I don't think that's amazing. But when you think about what went into the creation of this apple, you might be a little bit amazed. Apples have a lot of sugar. If you bite into an apple, it is crisp. It's got a lot of meat, for lack of a better word, and not a lot of seeds, right? There's not a lot of seeds in an apple compared to some fruits, right? The seeds are concentrated in the middle. Mostly outside of that, you have a lot of sugar, that delicious goodness that animals enjoy, right? So I want you to take a second and draw what you think an ancestral apple might look like. What might the ancestral apple, unaffected by humans and agriculture, what might that apple look like? You can pause it if you want. I'll give you a second. You should have drawn something like this. This is an example of what an ancestral apple might have looked like. And as you'll notice, they're very small. They probably have a high seed to sugar with a low amount of sugar. So high seed to sugar ratio, meaning that there's a lot less sugar per seed. And that makes sense. Ancestral apple trees, why would they want to waste their energy making these massive apples, right? Those populations, that trait would not be favored in that environment, right? A trait that would be favored is being able to make an apple that is, large enough that animals want to eat it, but still have plenty of seeds to where you're passing on your genes somewhere else. So really, this is an example again. I'll harken back to of stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection, right? Don't want to be too big. Don't want to be too small. A Goldilocks zone is perfect, right? But this is an ancestral apple. Now we have, through years of breeding, right, started selecting for larger and larger apples, right? And a lot of these lines have died out. We selected for larger and larger apples until we ended up with today's apple, right? And of course, many different lines of apples have died out along the way. And we've ended up, through artificial selection, with this, what we like to term superior apple. Superior from our perspective, but these trees would not do as well in the wild because, again, they're wasting too much energy on the production of those energy-rich substances. Now, we have a modern innovation called genetic modification. In which now we don't need to go through this process of artificially selecting over generations and generations and generations. We can directly modify DNA. Some of you guys might have heard this in the news. They're often vilified, unjustly, GMO technology, right? Genetically modified organisms. People frown upon these because people say, natural good. Science bad. This is kind of the prevailing opinion, and this is literally probably as deep as most of these arguments go, right? Unfortunately, it's a bit more complex than that. GMOs are an amazing technology, and it is actually instrumental in feeding many underdeveloped nations and adding vitamin D to rice and things of that nature. So, GMOs are good. And it's also impressive because we're able to bypass generations and generations and generations of artificial selection, which was the process we used to have to go through to generate these delicious, juicy red apples here. Okay, I also want to talk today about convergent evolution. So this is another part of topic 7.3 that they kind of put in here, convergent evolution. And I want to talk about this by just giving you an example of convergent evolution. So I have a flying squirrel and a sugar glider here. You might think, oh, well, they look exactly alike. They have similar these wingspans where it looks like they can fly from tree to tree. And you're right, that's what they do. So you might think that, oh, these things have a very recent common ancestor here, right? I'm drawing I'm going to draw a little phylogenetic tree here. And then you'd think, oh, they're probably more closely related to each other than they would be to something like humans, right? And it would make sense if you looked at their morphology. Morphology meaning the anatomy, structure, anatomy or structure of an organism. Sorry for my bad handwriting. And I really wouldn't blame you if you thought that, right? You're like, oh, hey, they look a lot alike, have a lot of similarities. They're probably very closely related, right? Unfortunately, in this case, you would be wrong. Sugar glider and the flying squirrel are not that closely related. So let me go ahead and erase this stuff. Okay. So they're actually, again, as I was saying, these are not two super closely related species. See if I can get this slide to move forward. They're actually, the flying squirrels we are more closely related to the flying squirrel, or the flying squirrel is more closely related to us than it is to a sugar glider, right? Now keep in mind, all life does originate from a single source here, but there's more recent common ancestry between the sugar glider and other marsupial animals. Marsupials, you might not know this, you might know this. This might be something you've learned along the way, are like mammals in many ways, but in many ways they're different. For instance, the sugar glider has a pouch which it actually can carry its young in. These live in Australia. Right? These live in Australia, and flying squirrels do not live in Australia. So this is kind of similar, if you remember back to Darwin's finches, of us having an island, right? Species breaking off, one species here, divergence on another island. You had this kind of occur with Australia, but way before we branched off, right? Now, you might be asking yourself, why do they look so similar if they're not related? Well, the reason for that is something called convergent evolution. They have similar diets, probably. They live along in a similar environment. So they tend to converge on a certain optimal form. In this case, it is a squirrel with these wing-like structures that allow it to fly short distances. In other words, their morphology is converging. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're extremely closely related. Again, in fact, we are more closely related to a flying squirrel than we are to the sugar glider by a good deal, and the flying squirrel is more closely related to us than it is to this very similar looking organism. So don't always, long story short, you can't judge a book necessarily by its cover. Sometimes animals that look very similar might not be very closely related at all. They might be undergoing a process called convergent evolution. All right, thank you.